Please come again with a name.
Yes, it's Galanga Salif.
All right.
Galanga, est-ce que tu peux lever la main en vous servant du contrôle réagissement? Comme ça, est-ce que vous pouvez lever la main en vous servant de la fonction réaction? Comme ça, Shadrach verra qui vous êtes.
Ah, d'accord.
Voilà. Merci. Shadrach, Galanga has raised his hand in the window so you can see who is who. And you're co-hosted. Okay, thank you. C'est fait, Galanga, vous êtes co-host maintenant.
Merci.
Super. Thank you, Shadrach.
Okay, I am now. I think it's 10:15 a.m. So the session can now start. So also the session is good. Yeah, so have a nice session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadrach. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on the participants window to see as people join. We'll just give it a minute to make sure that we have everyone who's planning to join us for this session this morning. Okay, so I think out of respect for the people who are here, we will begin as close to schedule as we can. The session is being recorded, so anyone who is not able to join us live can catch up afterwards. And I hope we'll find this an interesting and informative session. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robin Wilton. I'm from the Internet Society, where I'm Director for Internet Trust. And it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this session on the decision-making framework for policies that affect encryption. And I'm delighted to be joined by 3 members of a student group from University College London. Now, these are 3 students who have completed a master's course in Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, or STEP. And the topic of their project for the summer was a decision-making framework for policies that affect encryption. So their task was to do an enormous amount of desk research and documentary research, supplemented by interviews, to find out what factors policymakers should take into account when crafting policies that have an impact on encryption and digital safety and privacy. So the one other thing I wanted to announce was, and they're going to hate me for doing this, but I'm delighted to say that all 3 of the speakers here not only completed their course, but got distinctions for it as well. So congratulations to all 3 of you. And I'd like to hand over to the team to present their research methodology and the findings that they came up with.
Great, thank you, Robert. That's a very kind introduction. Yeah, thank you. Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Kirthika, and my team and I are here, and we're delighted to be presenting at the AfIGF. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us this morning. The session today is titled A Decision Framework for Regulating Encryption, and it is a research project that has been undertaken at the University College London in partnership with the Internet Society. I'd like to introduce the small but mighty research team. I'm joined today with my colleagues Zoe, who served as the project manager, and Adiola, who is the quality and risk officer on this project. So today's session will be structured in the following manner. We will give you a brief introduction of the project, then walk you through our desk-based and primary research findings. Then we'll discuss the following deliverables, followed by recommendations for policymakers before opening up the floor for Q&A. So it's been a very exciting time to be working on encryption, as there have been many interesting global developments occurring in the past 6 months. This has really highlighted how decisions related to encryption are really at the fore. The most notable headline that you might recognize was the global sting operation ANOM, where the FBI launched an encrypted messaging app for criminals. Sorry, can you hear me? It's all right. So I just got a message saying my internet is unstable, but I'll keep that.
Yes, the audio is fine for me as far as I can tell. Yep.
Okay, I'll continue.
There was a little crossover from the interpretation, but
okay. So yeah, you might recognize the most notable headline, which is the global sting operation ANOM, where the FBI launched an encrypted messaging app for criminals, which resulted in over 800 suspects in 16 countries being arrested. The other headline you might have heard of was also Apple's plans to introduce a new client-side scanning system, which would scan pictures that iPhone users upload onto the cloud for child sexual abuse material. Next slide. This research is particularly relevant to AfIGF as a multilateral and multi-stakeholder forum that seeks to promote secure and stable internet in Africa, which strong encryption enables. Additionally, this research is also aligned with the elements of the AU Digital Transformation Strategy for Africa 2020. Specific stated objectives of the DTS clearly align with themes of our research, which are socio-political and economic. Encryption plays a pivotal role in ensuring security, confidentiality, and privacy in our online interactions, which help to promote open standards, interoperability for cross-border trust frameworks, personal data protection, and privacy. Encryption is also vital for digital payments to work, and therefore it's important to the aim of the DTS to create an enabling environment to facilitate digital trade and boost Africa's position in the digital economy. There are also crossovers with our research and elements of the DTS conceptual framework. Our research looks at cross-cutting themes such as digital identity, cybersecurity, privacy, data protection, and in critical sectors such as digital trade and financial services. The foundation pillars of creating an enabling environment, policy, and regulations stated in the DTS are also explored in our research. So just to give you a brief overview of our project, it explored the impact of weakening encryption on key stakeholders and the factors at play when making decisions related to the weakening of encryption. It studied this through two main lenses, the socio-political and economic. Socio-political here refers to the infringement of civil liberties, some of which are privacy, freedom of expression, and assembly. The economic lens comprised of product innovation, consumer trust, and economic competitiveness. There are two deliverables for this project. Firstly, it's an impact assessment that weighs up the benefits and risks of weakening encryption. And secondly, a decision-making framework to guide policymakers in the current regulatory discussion and proposals on encryption. So our main research question is, what should policymakers be aware of and consider in the weakening of encryption technologies? We also developed 3 sub-research questions to help investigate the overarching research question. These are, what are the means of weakening encryption? What are the justifications for weakening encryption? And what are the impacts of weakening encryption? And we used 4 methods to produce our final deliverables. 3 of these were desk-based, and the desk-based research methods were a rapid evidence assessment, a systematic grey literature review, a causal loop diagram. And the primary research was conducted in the form of interviews, which followed a variant multi-criteria decision analysis and utilized a web-based tool called multi-criteria mapping. Excuse me. Moving on to our desk-based research findings, 28 articles were identified for analysis, and of that, the African and Asian regions were underrepresented. We addressed this lack of evidence and representation in our primary research. In terms of thematic focus, only 13% contain economic themes, which highlighted the dearth of academic evidence in this area. We complemented the academic evidence with grey literature, as it is a valuable source of evidence, especially on a policy issue like encryption. And for this, we followed a very similar process to the rapid evidence assessment, where we constructed a prisoner framework and utilized a modified ACOTS checklist to ensure that all articles were selected of a good quality. And finally, what we found from our grey literature and our academic evidence featured in our causal loop diagram, which was constructed to better understand the issue linkages present in the encryption debate. The causal loop diagram constructed here shows the economic issue linkages on the left and the socio-political issue linkages on the right. The purpose of constructing a CLD was to map out the different variables that are associated with weakening encryption and how each factor associates with another in an ecosystem. So here you can see by weakening encryption, you compromise the integrity of communication system, which has a whole host of negative effects, such as that on consumer trust, privacy of users, national security, and economic competitiveness. And here you can see there are more orange arrows, which are the negative relationships than the positive relationship. So though the stated benefit of weakening encryption to allow law enforcement access to private communication would assist in criminal investigations and consequently improve national security, it is outweighed by the many negative effects. And now I'll pass it on to Zoe, who will talk us through our primary research findings.
Thanks, Karthika. So in terms of our primary research findings, interviews were held throughout July of this year. In total, 17 interviews were held with stakeholders from civil society organizations, industry, and policymakers. Based off of our REA findings, we made a definitive effort to diversify the geographic coverage of our interviewees. Resultantly, participants were from Africa, Asia, Europe, the US, and the UK. Of the 17, 13 were from civil society organizations, 3 were from industry, and 1 was a policymaker participant. Multi-criteria decision analysis is a decision-making tool that incorporates multiple interests of stakeholders to generate scores or ranks to guide policy debates. Given the complexity of the encryption debate across different countries, the MCDA was adapted such that the findings did not prescribe particular weights or champion a specific decision. This variant MCDA revealed nuanced insights into the nature of decision-making regarding weakening encryption. This process was performed on a web-based multi-criteria mapping tool developed by the University of Sussex and their Science Policy Research Unit. We used the tool and applied its process to each interview. The process involved appraising a range of set options, defining factors relevant to these options, assessing scores and assigning weights, whilst considering ranks and exploring uncertainty behind these appraisals. The first step of the MCM interviews was for participants to appraise a set of options that we had already defined. So the first option was option 1, restrict encryption technologies through technical means, which included direct technical interference to decrypt the encrypted data, such as using a key escrow system. Option 2 was restrict encryption technologies through non-technical means, which would include more indirect means such as using state actors to access encrypted data, including issuing mandates, for example, for a compelled disclosure of decryption keys. And option 3 was do not restrict encryption at all via any means. Findings from the interviewees' appraisals show that option 3 was ranked as having the best performance across all interviewee groups. And as you can see here, the overlap noted between options 1 and 2 in the civil society and industry charts is due to some interviewees considering both options 1 and 2 to be the same. The interviewees were then asked to define factors relevant to their appraisal of these options. Based on this, interviewees identified a total of 66 factors. So we used a method called qualitative coding to group these factors into 11 more general themes known as codes. And this really assisted with our analysis and to make sense of it more. These codes included human rights, such as the right to privacy and freedom of expression and digital rights, the purpose and use case of encryption, including legal tests of necessity and proportionality, and cybersecurity impacts. Each stakeholder group was then asked to assign a weighting to the codes they had given as to how important each code, to how important they considered each code when making decisions about weakening encryption. The civil society group provided weights for 8 out of 11 codes. Human rights was weighted highly within the group. However, purpose had the highest weight allocated to it, and it was really emphasized that there was a need for clear objectives and justifications for weakening encryption. Public safety and trust in the government and state were given the lowest weighting within this stakeholder group. Industry stakeholders provided 7 of the 11 codes, weighting economic and cybersecurity concerns most highly, including the need to ensure pure transactions online. Public safety was weighted the lowest, and it was raised that law enforcement's ability to detect criminal activity is unlikely to be affected due to poor funding. The policymaker weighted 4 out of the 11 codes, giving the highest weightings to purpose and human rights. Legal context and the nature of government were given lower weightings, but they were discussed and their importance was raised, particularly due to the fact that less democratic states could be influenced into adopting restrictive encryption policies. I will now pass over to Adiola to discuss our deliverables.
Thanks, Zoe. So as mentioned in the project brief, our research produced an impact assessment and a decision-making framework. In the impact assessment, we weighed the benefits and risks of weakening encryption and represented these findings through sociopolitical and economic perspectives. Under the social-political benefits of weakening encryption, our findings showed that law enforcement leveraged the going dark narrative to claim that they can preserve national security and uphold public safety by weakening encryption. However, this benefit is counterintuitive, as weakening encryption could lead to system vulnerabilities that bad actors can exploit to commit crime, which in turn could compromise national security. Our research also indicated that state actors have successfully obtained digital evidence through alternative means like targeted hacking, which does not threaten systems on a large scale. The second claimed benefit prioritizes life based on the grounds of moral necessity. So supporters of weakening encryption argue that the trade-off in this debate is not between data privacy and law enforcement. Instead, it is between data protection and human life. As such, this argument implies that access to encrypted data to prevent terrorist attacks, for example, supersedes the need to protect individual data. Like the first benefits, though, this is also counteracted by identified risks, which we'll discuss in the risk section. On the other hand, our research did not find any economic benefits to weakening encryption. We noted several sociopolitical risks of weakening encryption, such as increased cybersecurity vulnerabilities, divergence from international norms, and the creation of a potentially dangerous precedent such that flawed democratic states are inspired to adopt restrictive encryption policies, especially when traditional democracies implement such policies. An inconsistent legal landscape that could complicate transnational cooperation and create opportunities for jurisdiction forum shopping. This is a situation where states purposefully collaborate with overseas law enforcement to circumvent local or national investigation procedures. Disproportionately impacted vulnerable groups like children, protected groups, LGBT communities, and domestic abuse survivors, as they would be unable to associate freely and access support safely. Infringements on rights to privacy and freedom of expression as enshrined in Articles 12 and 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the potential opportunities for increased state abuse of power through exceptional access and widespread surveillance activities. Under the economic risk of weakening encryption, we found the possibility of limited opportunities for innovation to build encrypted products and reduced options of encrypted services being available to consumers. Significant economic losses arising from security breaches and loss of customer or corporate data, reduced consumer confidence and trust regarding the security and confidentiality of their data, decreased economic competitiveness of a country due to a potential loss of customers or compliance difficulties that force companies to move to countries with no restrictive encryption policies. And finally, the inability of states to participate in international trade agreements which prohibit the weakening of encryption. The impact assessment therefore suggests that the risks of weakening encryption outweigh its claimed benefits. It is also important to note that these benefits may be achieved through less technologically invasive means. Our second deliverable, the decision-making framework, is based on stakeholder perspectives, and it emphasizes socio-political and economic concerns related to the encryption debate. As it is non-prescriptive, the framework recognizes and reflects the multi-layered nature of encryption-related discussions, and so it does not provide any wrong or right answers. Instead, it is developed around a set of deliberative questions under 3 sections: the purpose of weakening encryption technologies, capacity requirements for law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and the geopolitical effects of weakening encryption technologies. Under purpose, our findings indicated that the objectives of weakening encryption are largely unclear, and this could create loopholes for possible misuse by state actors. So as an example, the objectives of India's traceability guidelines appear to be quite ambiguous, as there is a question of whether these guidelines are actually meant to combat fake news or for surveillance purposes. So sociopolitical questions in this area are defined around context, means, impacts, and accountability, while the economic questions relate to establishing costs that relate to accountability and impacts. For law enforcement and intelligence capacity requirements, we found that encryption does not completely hinder investigatory procedures, since available metadata are known to facilitate investigations, a point we already established in the impact assessment. Sociopolitical concerns in this section raise questions around defining capacity requirements and alternative investigative means for law enforcement and intelligence agencies, while the economic concerns focus on funding requirements to enhance law enforcement skills. Regarding the geopolitical effects of weakening encryption, our findings point to the possibilities of perverse incentives being created such that service providers supply products with compromised encryption technologies to state actors. So questions in this section relate to the sociopolitical implications of deviating from established legal norms, as well as precedent setting, and the economic implications on national economies and transnational agreements in general. Geopolitical effects are especially important given how policy transfers or diffusions can occur at national, regional, and global levels. In recommending the use of our research deliverables, policymakers should apply this decision-making framework within context of their own national priorities or governance styles. We also advise the inclusion of wider and less heard stakeholder perspectives in the decision-making process. In addition, we recommend the establishment of international fora where the global implications of encryption-related decisions may be exclusively discussed. And as reflected in the impact assessment, policymakers should also consider the impacts of these decisions on broader factors like cybersecurity, civil liberties, the economy, and of course, vulnerable groups. This could be achieved through participatory stakeholder engagement sessions. Finally, it is recommended that policymakers set up guidelines for exceptional access to encrypted data and information. These guidelines may be useful in curbing abuse or misuse of such access and could include elements like purpose, necessity, and proportionality tests, legal frameworks, and judicial oversight. In performing this research, we delivered valuable outcomes like focusing the current encryption-related work in parts of Africa, investigating the apparent under-researched economic impacts of weakening encryption, developing a coding framework that could be adapted for future research, and designing a non-prescriptive and adaptable decision-making framework that incorporates diverse stakeholder views. So what does this all mean for the African Internet Governance Forum? As a platform set up to support inclusive, multilateral, multi-stakeholder, and multilingual discussions, the forum could adopt and adapt the coding framework we developed for use in its governance deliberations around maintaining an open, secure, and trustworthy internet for Africa. The other suggested actions that could be taken include in individual regions or countries on the continent, testing the decision-making framework to ascertain its robustness and utility. This could be achieved by generating scenarios using tabletop exercises like personas and workshops, or simulation methods like wargaming. By doing these tests, the yet unknown aspects of the decision-making framework, such as its strengths and weaknesses, uncertainties, and underlying assumptions could be further revealed. This brings us to the end of our presentation. Our research reports with the detailed findings and references can be accessed through the QR code displayed on the slide here. Thank you for listening to us, and we now look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much to all three of you. And again, I think this has been an amazing piece of research, which the team had to do as well as their actual coursework. So this was kind of on top of all the rest of their workload. So I hope this has been of interest to the audience. We are happy to take questions, which you can submit either via the chat or by raising your hand, which the simplest way to do that is in your Zoom client at the bottom, there's a reactions button. And under the reactions button, you have the option of raising your hand. So anyone who would like to ask a question is welcome to do so. I had one question via the chat, which was about how to access the report itself. And as Adeola said, one way to do that is via the QR code here. And I will also post the URL for that report in the chat as well. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand. I know, African audiences are always very shy. They don't like to speak up, and it's something we just have to accept and cope with. As you've seen, the team are very friendly and approachable. They won't bite you if you ask a question. Okay, I will put, there we go. In the chat now is the URL for the full research report, which you're welcome to download. It's free to access. So coming back to the points, the conclusions and recommendations that Adeola mentioned, I think it's important to stress that in this area, if you're planning to do further work, you don't start with nothing. Obviously, here you have 4 very clear recommendations as to what policymakers should take into consideration when planning this kind of policy. But I think beyond that, in the African context, there are some other things that can help you get started. First, as Adeola mentioned, there are regional groupings within Africa that mean you can address these issues, not just on a country basis, but also amid the regional groupings. So the North, East, West, Southern, and Central African groupings that already exist, that are catered for by the African Union Commission, and so on. So because so many of these issues are cross-border ones, you may find that working in a regional group is a valid approach and gets you more benefits than a single country approach.
Ce sont des recommandations basées sur les recherches qui ont été menées par le premier groupe qui avait juste présenté.
Galongo, je vous entends, oui, avec votre traduction là.
Oui.
Ok. So.
Merci. J'avais un peu de difficultés, mais maintenant je crois que ça va.
Ok, d'accord. Megan, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Megan a une question.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, all right. So I had a question on how do you balance encryption or access to encrypted data and collection of metadata, because there are instances where
Comment faire la balance?
I'm sorry, Megan. Could you repeat? And I will see if we can manage the interpreter.
Certain types of metadata and encrypted data, because in some instances, you will have much more information. You were able to gather or amass more data from metadata than encrypted data. So how do you balance the two? And as technology evolves, do you foresee encryption being applied to metadata as well?
Yes, okay, that's an interesting question. So this has to do with the alternative sources of actionable data if you can't get access to the encrypted content itself. And so part of Megan's question is about access to data which is currently accessible in clear, often referred to as metadata. And an example of this would be if I send someone an encrypted email, the destination of the email and the sender and the time of sending are all passed in clear. They have to go in clear so that they can be processed by the messaging application. It's a little bit like writing the address on the envelope of a letter. If the postman can't read the address, he can't put it in the correct postbox. So metadata passed in clear is definitely one of the alternative sources of data accessible without weakening encryption. In some areas, there are technical moves to increase the amount of metadata that is encrypted. In the internet example, when we visit a website, the translation of the name of the website into the more technical IP or internet address is done via a request to a DNS server, a domain name service. Now, that data usually passes currently in clear. So the name of the website you're trying to access will go from your browser to the DNS server in clear, and the IP address, the internet protocol address of the website, will be sent back to your browser again in clear. This generates a set of metadata which can be extremely revealing, because it may not show the contents of the pages that you look at, but it shows the details of every website that you visit, and the time you visited it, and conceivably from where. And that's a very rich and revealing data set. So technically, there are means to encrypt those exchanges of data so that third parties cannot see them, and possibly even to conceal the address of the website you're trying to reach from some of the intermediaries who have to do the translation from web address to IP address. So Megan, I hope that gives you some of the technical background to that question. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to raise your hand again.
Si vous n'êtes pas tout à fait satisfait, vous êtes libre de soulever les mains pour poser encore d'autres questions.
Thank you for your feedback. I got it.
Je crois que la réponse a été donnée.
So, any thoughts from the team? Do you have something about this narrative of going dark? Did you get a sense from the interviews of whether that narrative is a compelling one, credible, or did you feel that it was more of a narrative than anything else?
Okay. Yeah, I'll start then. If the team wants to add anything else, I would. Yeah. So we did get a sense of there being too much focus on criminal activity or crimes being committed at the expense of wider societal issues. And this is also like complemented by the fact that metadata, like you explained, is already available data. It's not hidden data. It's I mean, anyone who goes looking for it would find metadata. So there's, which is why the decision-making framework does not give you answers. It doesn't say this is what you should do, rather is a set of questions that forces or makes policymakers think through some of these things. If you're arguing that on the going dark narrative, are you really going dark, or is it a question of maybe the lights have been turned low and you can't see as clearly, but you're not completely blind? So we did get that sense, but the decision-making framework is supposed to address other discussions around the encryption debate.
Thank you, Adiola. And again, Megan, if you have follow-up questions on that, please feel free. I think that topic, as Adiola said, raises the question of how policymakers and other decision makers should balance these narratives. Certainly, one civil society advocate said in response to the going dark narrative, he said, it's not really true that law enforcement is going dark. Actually, they have access to more data and more information than they have ever had in human history. And he said, if they're going blind, he said, it's not because things have gone dark, it's because they're staring at the sun, which I thought was an interesting perspective. There is so much more data that the likelihood that encryption is a fatal obstacle to law enforcement seems less and less plausible. So more broadly, I think what this highlights is the point that there are narratives about the need for interception or for access to encrypted data. But there are certainly reasons why those narratives should be inspected, examined, and sometimes challenged. So I hope what this decision-making framework does is give you some starting points for examining and, where necessary, challenging those narratives. In particular, I would like to highlight two. The first is the going dark narrative that we've just discussed. The second is the narrative of child abuse and child safety. Now, I in no way wish to minimize the seriousness of the problem of child abuse and the need for protection of children, whether online or offline. But one of the outcomes, partially of this research and partially of other stakeholder meetings that the Internet Society has conducted, suggests that this framing of encryption or as a child safety issue is both partial and sometimes lacking in evidence to support it. And so something that I would hope from this decision-making framework is that the conversation can continue, but with a full framing, where the interests of all stakeholders are properly taken into account. And second, that those discussions either reveal where there is a lack of evidence or help point to ways in which that evidence can be gathered. Because I think one of the most dangerous things is to put policies into place that damage or undermine encryption and which don't achieve their ultimate objectives. And the risk of not achieving the ultimate objectives is higher if we take a partial view and prioritize the interests of just one set of stakeholders. So the multi-stakeholder approach recommended here, I think, is fundamental to the success of this decision-making framework. So we have a few minutes left. I'm conscious that there are still several people who haven't asked a question, but Megan, yes, please, go ahead.
All right. My second question would relate to the legislation used by law enforcement agencies to access encrypted data, such as the United Kingdom's Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. Come across any piece of legislation that equates to this legislation, or is better than the United Kingdom's Act?
Okay, I think so. I might need you to correct me, Megan. I think your question is, have we come across effective legislation in this area, or legislation that is better than the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act?
Yes, that's my question.
I think the short answer to that is this is still a very live and unresolved debate. In fact, even today, the UK Parliamentary Committee scrutinising the Online Safety Bill has just today released its report from its evidence gathering and its interviews on precisely this topic. How should the UK legislate going forward to balance these needs of privacy, freedom of expression, access to encrypted data, and prevention of online harm? So I think the simple answer is countries across the world are still trying to find an effective way to legislate on this topic. As far as the committee report today is concerned, looking at the press release for that report, I think it highlights one of the issues that I just described. The press release lists some of the stakeholders who the committee consulted and on whose evidence it has based its recommendations. But I think if you look at that list of consulted stakeholders, you will see that it is incomplete and that it favours one particular framing of the problem of access to encrypted data, and that therefore it doesn't represent the full multi-stakeholder approach recommended in this framework. So I think there is considerable scope for improvement here in the way that these legislative projects are undertaken.
Can I also just jump in there as well? I think we found during our research, we actually looked at the Regulatory Investigative Power Act, and we found that there was actually a loophole within it, and it proved to not be very effective because, for example, with criminals suspected of crimes and law enforcement would like to get access to the data, they can compel disclosure of decryption keys from the criminals. But the punishment for not giving up these keys was a maximum of 2 to 3 years imprisonment. So often we were seeing that criminals would decide to do that and take the 2 to 3 years imprisonment for not giving up their keys, rather than potentially give up the keys, reveal incriminating data, and as a result get a higher prison sentence. So there was some sort of loopholes that we found consistently within these acts that show that we don't think they're very effective as they currently stand. So there definitely is room for improvement.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gallagher and Zoe. So this effectiveness test is one that I think has not been applied enough yet. We have one last question. I think we have 3 minutes to go. We have a question from Herman Ramos in the chat. Herman would like to know, how can states ensure the balance between control, that is law enforcement, and privacy? And what role can encryption play in avoiding authoritarian regimes? What role can encryption play? I'm going to rephrase that slightly. What role can encryption play in protecting citizens' rights under authoritarian regimes? Kirtika, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that it's a balance that kept coming up quite a lot. The kind of need for access to encrypted data for law enforcement for purposes, and the kind of protection of privacy. But and on that, actually, I think the slide that we're on is actually when we developed our decision-making framework, that we came up with 3 different kind of broad kind of themes that decision makers should be looking at. And for this one, I would think the purpose of weakening encryption technologies is perfect, because the questions that from our interviews and what people were saying, it was really because this framework is non-prescriptive and it is so dependent on the kind of governance of countries, so democratic to authoritarian, it is really necessary for each country to consider the reasons for why they would like to weaken encryption and what they would like to achieve from that. And so here we've got 4 kind of broader kind of under the socio-political, so the context. So what are the considerations that you're looking at? Is it criminal investigation, national security, public safety? And I think that varies greatly in different countries. So that I think that it's just something to think about, because this decision-making framework doesn't give you a yes or no. It gives you questions to guide your policy making. And I think that, and every country has a different sense of it and how much they would like to protect privacy versus access to law enforcement. Again, like the big one that came up a lot was it, does it satisfy tests of proportionality and necessity? Are there alternative means? And that's really something that Robin already mentioned, is metadata is a very powerful source of information. Is it necessary to weaken encryption and access encrypted data if there is so much metadata available? And yeah, the legal and procedural safeguards to limiting the misuse. And this was something also that came up a lot, because law enforcement can misuse their access. And again, that comes back to the country and law enforcement and their ability and capabilities and how trusted they are. So again, it's a very, oh gosh, time is up. Sorry. Yeah, it's a balance. And I think definitely, if you read the report in detail, you've got more of an idea of the questions that should guide your decision making around this. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. There is one more question in the chat. Megan, I will have to take that offline because I'm afraid we're out of time, but I will take it offline. I'd like to finish by thanking everyone for joining today. I hope you found this informative and useful. I commend the report to you, and I hope that it will provide the basis for fruitful discussions with your policymakers and other stakeholders as they approach this sometimes intractable set of problems. Thank you so much, and I wish you a successful conference and enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.